Margaret adjusted the strap of her modest handbag as she stepped onto the sunlit walkway leading to the Golden Shores Beach Club. The warm breeze brushed against her silver-streaked hair, slightly tousling the strands that framed her gentle face. She wore a simple, faded sundress, the kind she had favored for years, comfortable and worn, not one of the elegant ensembles that seemed to float through the club's grounds. Around her, impeccably dressed guests laughed softly, their voices mingling with the distant crash of waves and the soft melodies drifting from the beach bar. The air smelled faintly of salt and sunscreen. Despite the luxury surrounding her, Margaret held her head high, her heart a mixture of nerves and quiet rebellion. Today was a small act of courage, a departure from the routine of her peaceful days volunteering at the local library and tending her small garden. She had saved a little money for this treat, a chance to sit by the water, soak in the sun, and feel a connection to the lively world that, for so long, had seemed a realm apart. From across the deck, Carl noticed her immediately. The beach club manager, with his sharply tailored blazer and a commanding presence, had spent countless afternoons ensuring the establishment radiated exclusivity. His sharp eyes scanned Margaret's plain attire and the hesitant way she clutched her bag. A frown crept across his face. "Excuse me," Carl said as he approached, his voice crisp and deliberate. "I'm afraid you don't quite fit the club standards here." Margaret blinked, unsure she heard correctly. I just wanted to enjoy the beach," she managed softly. Carl's gaze hardened. "This is an exclusive venue. We can't have just anyone wandering in." Nearby patrons paused mid-conversation, their attention drawn to the exchange. The breeze shifted, and so did the atmosphere. Margaret felt a flush rise to her cheeks as Carl's words hung in the air, leaving her isolated amidst the crowd. Carl's words echoed louder than he intended, though he didn't care. The murmurs around the club swelled, some guests exchanging glances, others whispering comments half-masked by politeness but dripping with curiosity. Margaret's throat tightened, the warmth of embarrassment and hurt blooming inside her chest. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said quietly, trying to maintain calm. Her voice wavered slightly, but she held herself erect. The years had taught her a certain dignity, even when the world seemed ready to overlook it. Carl's expression softened not a whit. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the club has strict policies to maintain an image that our members expect," he said firmly. "I have to ask you to leave." Margaret's gaze dropped to the polished wooden deck beneath her feet. The sunlight glittered, but all she could see was the sharp edge in Carl's eyes and the faces turning toward her with flickers of judgment. Several guests rustled in their chairs, some nodding in understanding, others glancing away awkwardly. She caught the briefest glimpse of a young couple near the bar, whispering and looking at her as though she were a curious exhibit rather than a human being. Before Margaret could respond further, a burly man in a security uniform appeared at Carl's side. "Sir, should I escort her out?" the guard asked, his tone deferential but unmistakably commanding. Carl nodded briskly. "Yes, please." Margaret took a slow step back. "I'm sorry, really, I don't want to cause inconvenience," she said. Her voice held more sorrow than anger. "Perhaps I should go." "Thank you for understanding," Carl said, though his words lacked warmth. As the security guard moved toward her, a few of the club's guests shifted in their seats, some offering sympathetic looks, others appearing relieved that the situation was being resolved swiftly. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. She wanted to believe that kindness might surface from somewhere, but the reaction of the crowd left her feeling exposed, fragile under their scrutiny. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse, pulling out a neatly folded handkerchief to blot the sheen of perspiration on her forehead. Carl's gaze never faltered, sharp and assessing, as though he were inspecting a blemish on a perfectly polished surface. "Let's not make a scene," Carl said quietly, but firmly. Margaret nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as the security guard reached out gently to guide her toward the beach club's entrance. She walked slowly, head bowed, the whispers growing softer behind her but no less present. The sun beat down, a contrast to the chill settling deep within her. It wasn't just the embarrassment, though that was bitter enough. It was the sudden realization of how deeply out of place she felt in this world. A world that valued appearances over substance, wealth over warmth. Outside the club's gates, Margaret paused and let out a shaky breath. Her eyes flicked to the chauffeur-driven Maserati parked down the street, the sleek car gleaming under the afternoon sun. Though it was a familiar sight, it felt as if this had nothing to do with her now. The simple dress she favored was all anyone saw, and it was the only thing anyone would judge. With trembling fingers, she pulled out her phone and dialed her daughter's number. Her daughter, Clara, always quick to steady her with gentle reminders of worth beyond looks and status, answered after a few rings. "Mom? What's wrong? Are you okay?" Clara's voice was full of concern. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a small, hopeful smile. "I didn't stay long. The manager asked me to leave." "Oh, Mom," Clara whispered, her voice brimming with sympathy and frustration. "Why would they do that?" Margaret laughed softly, though it felt brittle. "Because I don't fit, apparently. Just a simple old woman in a worn dress isn't welcome here." Clara's silence was pregnant with empathy. "You're so much more than that, Mom. Don't let them define you." Margaret leaned back against the cool metal of the car door, letting the words settle. A faint resolve began to stir in her. Maybe this wasn't the end of the story. Back on the beach club patio, Carl stood observing the scene from a distance, a smug hint tugging his mouth corners. To him, this was a simple matter of maintaining standards, a necessary act in preserving the club's reputation. Margaret's discomfort was, in his eyes, a proof of the harsh but rightful exclusion. The guests resumed their conversations, but undercurrents of tension lingered, a quiet unease that lingered whenever an outsider was brusquely dismissed. A few whispered about Carl's stern actions. One woman, sharply dressed in a flowing linen suit, muttered to her companion, perhaps a bit harsh, "Isn't kindness more becoming?" Carl caught her remark but chose to ignore it, directing a steely gaze toward the club's entrance. The moment felt like a fragile thread, one that could snap at any second. Margaret's fingers curled into fists as she heard the low hum of conversations fading into background noise. Her gaze turned to the ocean, the waves rolling in endlessly, indifferent to human trials and judgments. Somewhere beyond the foam, she felt a whisper of strength rising within her, an invitation to return, not as a timid guest but on her own terms. The afternoon continued, the golden light shifting slowly toward evening. Carl's certainty remained unshaken, for now. But the lingering glance Margaret cast back toward the club's gleaming doors carried a quiet challenge. The beach club's elegant realm, meant to exclude her, had unknowingly set the stage for something very different, a story far richer than appearances could reveal. As the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon with strokes of coral and lavender, Margaret made her way home. The Maserati door clicked softly as she settled into its leather seat, the familiar comfort of the steering wheel beneath her hand steadying the flutter of emotions inside her chest. Her eyes reflected the twilight as she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I will return." The question now lingered like the salty breeze. What would you do if you were in Margaret's shoes? Would you walk away from such humiliation, or prepare to face it head-on? The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the sunlight pouring over the Golden Shores Beach Club as if nothing had happened the day before. The elegant grounds gleamed freshly swept, the lounge chairs neatly aligned, and the tables set for the day's visitors. Among the early arrivals, a familiar figure caught many eyes, Margaret. Except this time, she did not approach quietly or hesitantly. The entrance driveway was marked by a sudden gleam of polished metal and sleek design, the unmistakable shape of a silver Maserati idled nearby, reflecting the sunlight off its smooth curves. Margaret stepped out of the driver's seat, her posture calm but undeniably confident. The simple sundress she wore yesterday was replaced by a similarly modest outfit, but the car stirred a ripple of murmurs among the club's members and staff alike. Carl, overseeing the morning preparations as always, noticed the change immediately. His sharp eyes narrowed as he watched Margaret glide across the grounds, her step steady, her gaze unflinching. A few whispers rippled through the crowd, eyes darting between the luxury vehicle and the woman who now owned it. Margaret approached the club's reception area, where Carl stood with a forced smile, trying to mask his surprise and uncertainty. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice steady and polite. "I'm here to enjoy the club today." Carl cleared his throat, eyes still fixed on the Maserati parked just outside. "We spoke yesterday about the club's policies," he said cautiously. "I'm not sure." "I understand your concerns," Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. "But I am a member, and I've paid the fee." Carl blinked, taken aback. "You're a member?" "Indeed," Margaret confirmed. "I prefer to keep a low profile and dress plainly when I travel. Yesterday, I was just returning from a business trip." She smiled slightly, the kind of smile that hinted at unspoken stories. "Appearances, as you saw, do not always tell the whole truth." A few guests nearby had caught bits of the exchange, turning their heads to listen. Whispers floated, "She's a member? Who knew? Look at that car, there's more to her than meets the eye." Carl's jaw tightened as he met Margaret's gaze. The certainty he had worn like armor was faltering. Margaret continued, glancing toward a gathering crowd. "I believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they are dressed or how they appear." Carl fidgeted, clearly unsettled. Yet, he found himself without a solid argument to oppose her presence now. With a reluctant nod, he stepped aside. "Very well. Enjoy your day, Ms. Margaret," she replied. As Margaret walked past, an unmistakable hush fell over the cluster of guests and staff. The club's usual buzz shifted to a hum of astonished admiration. Some whispered their apologies for yesterday's judgment, while others glanced at Carl, their expressions questioning his earlier hardness. Seated near the pool, an elderly gentleman shifted his sunglasses down his nose, watching Margaret as she settled into a chaise lounge. Nearby women exchanged appreciative smiles, and younger guests looked on with new respect. Margaret's return was not just physical, it was different. She radiated an inner strength that transcended any clothing or status symbols. As Carl watched from a distance, a part of him battled unease, the image of a simple old woman transformed into something far more complex. Curious glances turned into subtle nods of approval when Margaret pulled a small tablet from her bag and began reviewing documents with focused attention. Bits of conversation drifted over. "She's an entrepreneur, I hear," said one man. "Runs several companies worldwide," whispered another. The crowd slowly began to embrace the revelation, the club's elite recognizing a figure who had been hiding in plain sight. Suddenly, a young woman approached Margaret hesitantly. "Excuse me, Ms. Margaret, I'm Claire. I'm sorry about yesterday, I shouldn't have judged you based on appearances." Margaret offered a warm smile. "Thank you, Claire. It means a lot." Carl overheard the exchange and felt a pang of regret. In the past, he prided himself on knowing his clientele, but this moment made him realize how often he had let assumptions cloud his judgment. Later, as the afternoon sun slid toward the horizon, the club's atmosphere had shifted. Conversations included laughter and genuine questions directed toward Margaret. She spoke with grace and charm, revealing glimpses of her true expertise without arrogance. Her easy manner and sharp intellect captured many hearts. Carl found himself caught in a silent admission. His narrow view had been wrong. The woman he had so readily dismissed had quietly returned and earned a place among them. Margaret, sensing the thaw, approached him as the day waned. "Carl," she said softly, "respect isn't simply about who you think belongs here. It's about recognizing value beyond appearances." Carl nodded, meeting her gaze with a mixture of respect and humility. "You've taught me something important today." Margaret smiled, the gleam in her eye a promise of kindness and quiet strength. The club, once her place of exclusion, was now a place where she belonged, not because of wealth or dress, but because of the grace and truth she carried with her. As the sun dipped below the waves, Margaret reflected quietly. She had faced judgment and exclusion, yet had returned with dignity and substance. The club's members had witnessed a lesson more valuable than any policy could dictate. Margaret's story was far from over. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the gently crashing waves, Margaret allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. She sat comfortably in one of the shaded lounge chairs near the water's edge at the Golden Shores Beach Club, the soft hum of the club's evening ambience swirling around her. Despite the earlier commotion, she felt a deep sense of peace, both from the calm ocean breeze and the knowledge that her story was finally being understood. Behind her understated appearance lay a life few had guessed, one that wove together years of hard work, perseverance, and unwavering humility. Margaret wasn't just an elderly woman who dressed simply and enjoyed the occasional seaside afternoon. She was a seasoned entrepreneur with a global footprint, a woman who had built several successful companies from the ground up. Yet, she never flaunted her achievements. Comfort and simplicity were her choice for personal style, especially during her extensive travels. Years ago, Margaret had embraced the challenges of leadership with determination. She had faced every skepticism, every whispered assumption about her gender and age, and had used those moments as fuel. The modest sundress she wore was not a sign of her status but a reminder of her roots, of a time when she had little but plenty of dreams. She wasn't one to chase after glamour. Instead, she sought authenticity in people and experiences. Her work-life balance had always been precarious, founding companies, overseeing expansive business operations across continents, and yet somehow finding time for family and meaningful volunteering. The local community center and library were her sanctuaries whenever she needed to recharge away from boardrooms and international calls. It was there that she reconnected with her values and nurtured the compassionate heart that guided her dealings both in business and everyday life. The humbling incident at the beach club the day before had struck a nerve not just because of the rejection itself, but because it illuminated society's fixation on appearances rather than substance. That narrow perspective had forgotten to look beyond the fabric of a dress to the fabric of a person. Carl, the manager who had confronted her with such certainty, had witnessed something unexpected during her return. The same man who had earlier delivered cold judgment now saw her, not as a simple woman in a faded dress, but as a formidable presence who commanded respect, not through attire, but through confidence and grace. Margaret thought back to their interaction, how Carl struggled, caught between his role enforcing club policies and the undeniable reality of her membership and character. It was a moment that challenged his own assumptions and perhaps opened a door to re-evaluating the rigid standards he had long upheld. In those fleeting glances, she glimpsed a man wrestling with discomfort, forced to confront the lesson she was quietly teaching: respect must transcend the superficial. Guests had started to approach her by day's end, their curiosity turning into genuine appreciation. Claire, the young woman who'd apologized, had become a friendly presence, eager to learn about Margaret's ventures and her unusual humility despite her vast accomplishments. Margaret recalled the flashbacks that often accompanied moments like these, memories of early mornings poring over business plans, of endless phone calls across time zones, and of moments of solitary reflection where doubts had crept in. She remembered the times her determination had been questioned simply because she was a woman stepping into a male-dominated arena. Her life had been a balancing act, but never once had she sought to overshadow her true self with pretenses. Instead, she invited people to see past surface level and to value the quiet power of integrity, perseverance, and kindness. The beach club, gleaming and polished, was a juxtaposition of all Margaret stood against and defended. It was a place reliant on exclusivity and image, while she embodied inclusivity and substance. Yet today, sitting among the very guests who had barely glanced her way the day before, she felt the stirring of change, subtle, slow but promising. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Carl making his way toward her, a tentative smile lifting the corners of his mouth. He looked different somehow, less of the imposing figure who had dismissed her and more of a man willing to learn. "May I join you?" he asked softly. Margaret nodded, gesturing to the chair beside her. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Carl began, his voice steadier than she expected. "I realize I made a mistake yesterday. I judged you before knowing anything about you. That was wrong." She smiled warmly. "It takes courage to admit that." Carl sighed. "This club prides itself on its image. I thought I was protecting that, but I see now I was just blinded by a narrow view. You've reminded me that appearances can be deceiving." Margaret looked out toward the fading light over the ocean, feeling the calm settle deeply. Sometimes, the real story is beneath the surface. It's the choices we make, the lives we lead, the kindness we extend, that's what defines true worth. Their conversation drifted toward the changes Carl intended to pursue, aiming to make the club more welcoming and less judgmental. It was a small start, but in that moment, it felt significant. As twilight deepened, other guests approached with questions and smiles, their attitudes visibly softened. Margaret answered politely, sharing bits of her journey without extravagance. They listened intently, surprised by the depth behind the simple woman they had misjudged. Later that evening, as the club prepared to close, Margaret thought about returning to the quiet life she cherished. Yet, she also felt the quiet satisfaction of having carved a place for herself in a world that often favored appearances over authenticity. Her story was no longer just about exclusion but about the quiet power of dignity and resilience to transform perceptions. The sea whispered gently nearby, and Margaret took a deep breath, the salt air mingling with the newfound hope blossoming quietly within her. The members of the Golden Shores Beach Club had glimpsed the true essence of a remarkable woman, and the surface had only ever been a small part of the whole. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for Margaret, the affirmation of her identity and the respect she earned would carry her forward, beyond any superficial judgments. In the days following Margaret's triumphant return to the Golden Shores Beach Club, the reverberations of her presence were still being felt throughout the property. Carl's once rigid demeanor began to soften as his colleagues and the club's ownership started recognizing the misstep he had made when he confronted her. It wasn't long before the club's management stepped in with a firm message: Carl's handling of the situation was inappropriate and contrary to the welcoming and inclusive environment the club aspired to maintain. A formal reprimand was issued, and he was instructed to offer a sincere public apology to Margaret as well as a clear pledge to rethink the club's admission policies without prejudice. Carl stood in the club's sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the sunlit beach, the reprimand letter sealed and resting on his polished desk. The message upset his ego more than he cared to admit. He had always prided himself on maintaining the club's exclusive image, but now he recognized how deeply that pride had clouded his judgment, allowing him to judge a person by her appearance, without even trying to understand the individual. After several long moments staring out at the horizon, Carl picked up his phone and dialed the club's main lounge to speak with Margaret. When she answered, her voice was calm and measured. "Margaret, I wanted to offer my apologies for how I treated you," he began hesitantly, "and to thank you for teaching me an important lesson about respect and assumptions." There was a pause, then Margaret responded warmly, "Thank you, Carl. I appreciate your words. It's never easy to admit when we're wrong. Would you consider coming back again? I'd like to personally ensure that you're treated with the respect you deserve." Margaret smiled softly, "I would like that." Meanwhile, the club members had begun to embrace a shift in attitude. Many approached Margaret with kind words and apologies. One afternoon, a small group invited her for coffee at the club's beachside cafe, hoping to learn more about the quiet strength she embodied. Her stories of balancing a vast business empire with a commitment to volunteering endeared her further, and her modesty only heightened their admiration. Clara, Margaret's daughter, was also touched by the groundswell of support her mother had garnered. When they spoke over the phone, Clara's voice held a proud warmth. "Mom, you handled everything with dignity. I can't tell you how inspiring you are." Margaret replied, "It's not just about me, Clara. I hope this helps others who might feel judged or overlooked because of who they are or how they appear." Through it all, Margaret maintained her characteristic humility. The Maserati remained a quiet fixture in her daily routine, unnoticed by those who had come to appreciate her for her character rather than her possessions. She never flaunted her wealth, quietly choosing simplicity in dress and demeanor, reassuring others that elegance came from within. For Carl, the experience was transformative. Beyond the formal reprimand and the need to apologize publicly, he found himself re-examining the club's rigid standards and his role in enforcing them. He quietly advocated to the club's leadership for policy revisions that emphasized inclusivity alongside exclusivity, recognizing that respect and kindness were essential for the club's true prestige. Margaret's vindication was not merely about reclaiming her dignity, it was about opening a door for honesty and acceptance in a space previously defined by surface appearances. Her graciousness in returning and sharing her story allowed others to reconsider their biases and grow. One afternoon, as Margaret sat watching the sunset with a small gathering of friends from the club, Carl approached cautiously. "May I join you?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, patting the chair next to her. He smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Thank you for your patience and kindness. You taught me far more than I expected." Margaret nodded. "We all have lessons to learn, Carl." Their shared moment was a quiet symbol of change, an acknowledgement that humility and openness could bridge even the widest gaps. The events inspired many at the club to rethink their own assumptions. Conversations about respect, authenticity, and kindness became more frequent, fostering a community that valued substance over superficiality. Margaret continued to visit the beach club, never demanding special treatment but always given the warm welcome she deserved. She found joy in simple moments, walking along the shoreline, reading by the seaside, and engaging in heartfelt conversations with newfound friends. In the end, her story stood as a powerful reminder: true class and worth are not measured by the clothes one wears or the car one drives, but by the integrity, courage, and kindness one carries within. To our viewers, what would you have done if you were in Margaret's shoes? Or perhaps in Carl's? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your perspectives. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. See you in our next story.